Remember Mandalore? RK equals. Part 4. Command Bunker. Below the Royal Palace. Sundari. Mandalore. That's orbital bombardment. And the shields aren't up. I summed up the situation while the ground shook for the 5th time. Considering we were at least a kilometer below the surface, that was saying many things about what was happening to the capital, and none of them were good. Feeling tens of thousands die nearby and many more on the planet wasn't helping either, even if it was an old thing nowadays, just the price of being a trained Force adept. Of course, the dark side had to make it enjoyable, empowering and distracting business if I let her. Small wonder most Sith eventually went insane. We need the data links up yesterday. Satine frowned at the technicians who were busy doing just that. Primary landline is cut at the top and our wireless equipment is being jammed. We're trying to compensate and burn through. Most of the secondaries are either down or jammed too. All we know for sure is that a large fleet jumped between us and Concordia before engaging out Navy. The tech didn't elaborate on how well that was going on. We could feel it as another tremor shook the bunker. Damn the Confederacy. Bo growled. If we make it out of here in one piece, I'll be having a chat with our intelligence services. I grumbled quietly. I wasn't accustomed to feeling this helpless. It wasn't like I could do much while being stuck into this bunker, and leaving it while Sundari was bombarded wasn't the best idea ever. I'm a bloody idiot. So it's your fault then? A trace of Obi-Wan's usual Kenobi-ness entered his voice. Apparently he was recovering quite well from our verbal confrontation. I should have a proper fleet in orbit and not relied on the shield. Damn the political consequences, I lamented. I would have in the good old days while the planetary shield tech was just another super weapon cooked up by both sides of the Cold War. That would have been unacceptable, Satine said weakly. Is this acceptable then? Bo snapped at her sister. Of course not. The Duchess glared at my wife. Aren't you going to do something? Obi-Wan nodded at the women, looking temporarily lost. Do I look like an idiot? Given Palian's usual competence, he should have gotten the word out shortly after this mess began. The closest Venator battle group is 4 hours away. Obi-Wan pointed out. You would think so, wouldn't you? I have heavy reinforcements about 30 minutes or so out. Let's hope they will make it in time. Why didn't I know about that? Kenobi frowned at me. Need to know. I didn't want someone recalling that Force and leaving us vulnerable. I shrugged. Given my current rank and GAR command structure, it was well within my rights to do so. As far as most people were supposed to know, the Freedom and Company were either in the last stages of their raiding campaign or in transit towards a friendly port of resupply and repairs. Satine, you might be the only government Mandalore has left once we get out of here. You'll need to take charge and have a plan for the immediate aftermath. I changed the topic. We have contingencies for either attack or another civil war. The Duchess sighed. At least a few should do the trick. After this, Vizsla and the Death Watch need to go away. Bo added and gingerly rubbed the exposed side where her armor had been melted. Will you still try becoming Mandalore? Obi-Wan asked. Perhaps. We'll need to talk with the clan leaders who made it and make arrangements. Juggling being a Republic general and Mandalore will be an interesting experience. It would certainly eat up my time, even if the potential long-term gains might be significant. That was the rub of it. Was the war going to be over in the next couple of years, or would it drag on? I knew what was supposed to happen in canon, but those events were mostly derailed by now. Oh, Palpy's long-term plans were the same, turn the Republic into his empire, but reaching that stage and wrapping up the war was going to be quite interesting for everyone concerned. I closed my eye and took a deep breath. I had to finally make a decision, and soon. My plans were going on reasonably good given the overall situation, but if I was to go forward I had to make up my mind on how I wanted the galaxy to look like at the end of the wars. After almost a year in this place, one of my initial plans, the one concerning a reformed republic, was looking more and more like a pipe dream, or more likely, a recipe for another civil war. That left either co-opting Sidious's plan or building up my own faction. My work with the Mandalorians could fit either if I became Mandalore. First things first, sort out this mess and then figure out the long-term plan I'll be going out with. We've partially burned through the jamming. One tech exclaimed. There's a second fleet in orbit engaging the first. Then he paused. I'm reading most of our navy is lost. Only a single Keldable IFF in orbit above Sundari, a Venator and 4 frigates. That's Satine trailed off horrified. It was about 30 minutes or so since the unpleasantries started and the Mandalorian defense fleet was practically annihilated. The same went for my guard squadron. Here's to hoping that Palian make it out in one piece. At least I had the insight to keep the rest of my staff away from here. HK and Arya were supposed to be with the forces vacating Geonosis along with Piet and Veers. Ahsoka was still recovering in safety, and with the exception of Shark T, who was at Camino, those were the people I really cared about who weren't in the bunker with me. Not a big number, with a lot of them being more in the line of useful acquaintances than friends, but still, they might be enough to keep me from really going on in the deep end. When I persuaded them that my vision for the future of the galaxy was for the best, it would be worse on the ground. I concentrated on the issues at hand. I felt a lot of people dying, not only in Sundari. If the shields were down across the planet, even limited bombardment could cripple us. Satine's shoulders sagged. When all was said and done, today's Mandalore wasn't a particularly populated world. What made it important for the Mandalorians as a whole was that most of their industry was concentrated in here, while the majority of the population was spread all through the sector, with a few more millions playing mercs across the galaxy. Without a ready access to ships and heavy equipment, the Mandalorians were quite good infantry and excellent special forces, but only a shadow of what they could be if properly equipped. That's why Mandalore was important. Deny it to the Mandalorians and they wouldn't be too big a problem for the next few years when you consider the scales on which both the Republic and CIS operated, and the enemy might have succeeded in that. If the industrial capabilities of this world were sufficiently degraded, Mandalore was going to be a net drain for resources for the time being. Then there were the political consequences, though I probably had a few days before dealing with them at anything but the local level. Once we're reasonably sure no one is going to take us from orbit, we should make our way out and see how bad it is, I said. Yes, we should. Satine nodded numbly. Try finding out whoever survived from my government as well as the clan leader's status. Once communications are restored, announce that the Death Watch are a terrorist organization that just helped enemy forces bombard Mandalore. They're to be considered traitors to our people and handled accordingly. The Duchess stood straighter and spoke in a furious and determined voice. This was the first time I saw why Obi-Wan went after the woman. We may yet make a proper Mandalorian of you, sister. Bo nodded and smiled at Satine. I don't feel any immediate danger, Obi-Wan announced. Me neither, though we should be careful, I said after checking through the Force. I don't think that there was anyone left to bombard us. I would hold a case of the best Corellian brandy I could get my hands on. Let's go, Bo ordered and went to the elevator's control panel. She examined it for a moment and frowned. I don't think we'll be getting out that easily. The top levels have collapsed. There are additional exits, right? I asked. It was merely common sense. Yes. Satine looked at the guards. At least 2 we know of. The lieutenant in charge nodded. This way, ma'am. He pointed at the far wall. It was time to see how big a mess we had to clean up. Delcatar, you seem awfully detached. Bo trailed off. This is far from the first time I've been stuck on a world under orbital bombardment. Or ordered such for that matter. As for the inevitable casualties I felt, after seeing it happen dozens of times on much grander scale, you either get accustomed to it and find some way to deal with it or go insane. By any reasonable standards, any high-ranking Navy and Army officers in a galaxy-spanning power had to be somewhat warped in order to carry out their duties, because the price of doing business in our line of work was the death of millions, often billions, and seeing whole worlds burn as a matter of course. =RK=, Part 5, Mandal Motors HQ, Sundari, Mandalore. It took us a few hours to make our way from the bunker to one of the few intact buildings in the capital, Mandal Motors HQ, which had its own shield that protected it from the bombardment. While Sundari wasn't hit too many times, the orbital strikes either outright breached the dome or shattered it, raining burning and melted metal all over the city. There were sections where whole districts went up in fire, but the worst damage was caused by the dome collapsing over large areas of the capital. The overall death toll was estimated to be relatively low so far, but there were an awful number of missing or trapped persons, and most of them were unlikely to survive long enough to be dug out. We had a front row seat of the devastation as we made our way to Mandal Motors, where we were received by Yomagetu, who barely made it to safety before everything went to hell. Fortunately, the CEO was on board with using a part of his corporate HQ as a temporary seat of government, and even better, he was among the majority of Mandalorians who were fit to be tied after the Confederacy attack. I'll see them all burn for this, Satine seethed. The Duchess had been staring at the ruin that was most of the capital for the last 15 minutes, and all I could sense coming from her was unbound fury that would make a Sith proud. Obi-Wan was hovering protectively near his wife, but he was obviously distressed by her emotions and kept quiet. Meanwhile, Bo was out visiting the nearest armory to pick up an armor that lacked a large hole in its side. I agree with the sentiment, but first we need to put our house in order. Horus nodded. We were in his office and had a great view of the destruction. All emergency services were out in force, augmented by the MDF and civilian volunteers, but it wasn't going to be enough for far too many people. Commodore Holt is doing her best to coordinate things in orbit and keep any more wrecks from hitting the surface. I informed the not really responsive Duchess, who was for all intents and purposes the government. We've been unable to establish contact with any of the ministers. One of Yomaget's aides came near us and reported. The one piece of good news we have is that local MDF commanders have taken charge of SAR efforts in all affected areas, and we should have a complete picture shortly. We've got military units, supplies, equipment and volunteers streaming in from all over the planet. Status on the planetary shields? I asked. Still down. The main control center took a direct hit and the secondary ones are in Death Watch hands. We've got MDF units as well as some of your commando teams moving in. The same aide answered after glancing at the data pad in his hands. At least the generators are safe, I noted. They hadn't been struck from orbit, and I had Commodore Holt drop a battalion of Corellian troopers, a third of Freedom's security detachment, to secure the generators. Once we got at least one control center under control and made sure that the power network was sufficiently intact, Mandalore would be somewhat secure. Right now the only combat-capable friendlies in the system were the Freedom and her escorts. As powerful as that battle group was, it simply couldn't cover the whole planet against a smart opponent. Hopefully the Sith would lay low until some more reinforcements could reach the system. After all, the bastards did burn through a lot of their available reserve while trying to take us all out. Duchess Satine, right now our government might as well be gone. We need decisions on how to proceed. Yomaget changed the topic. Decisions? We're already doing all we can. Not that's enough, Satine whispered. What's happening with the Death Watch? She sighed and turned away from the window. Most of their newer members turned on them once Vizsla ordered an all-out attack on the Loyalist forces and the Confederacy began the orbital bombardment. There were firefights in dozens of locations all across Mandalore and Concordia. Once Loyalist forces were mobilized, most Death Watch elements were overrun. As far as we know, they still control only the SHIELD network control centers and 2 bases in the desert on Mandalore. However, there are significant holdouts on Concordia. The aide read from his data pad. Not good enough. Can we strike at Concordia without compromising the rescue operations? Not with what we have on the moon. Horus shook his head. Concordia is their stronghold after all. At least we have secure landing sites to use once we have the troops to send. Vizsla? Satine spat the name. Missing. He was supposed to be here in Sundari just before the attack, however his current status is unknown. Speaking about the enemy leadership, we've got confirmation that Grievous was in command of the Sith fleet that attacked us. I relayed what I learned from Holt's report after she had a few of the more intact Munificent boarded in order to secure intel. It's presumed that he made planetfall during the last stages of the battle after the Conqueror rammed his flagship. I want him found, Satine snapped. She turned around and looked at her husband. Obi-Wan, please find him and bring him to justice. Kenobi stared at his wife for a long moment and nodded. I'll make sure he's dealt with. Satine might actually be useful for knocking the more unpleasant Jedi traits from Obi-Wan. Good for him. You aren't going alone. Omega Squad should be here shortly to act as our protection detail. Once they arrive, make sure they're resupplied and then you can go hunting. I made sure that Obi-Wan didn't go out half-cocked, because I doubted that right now he was in the right state of mind to simply crush Grievous using the Force. That leaves us with the issue of government or the lack of one. Horus looked at Satine. Many will blame this mess on you along with Death Watch. That earned him a glare by Obi-Wan, yet Satine simply nodded. If we had a better and larger fleet, this might have been avoided. The Duchess waved at the devastated city visible behind her. It was my government that decided a naval refit and expansion would be a waste of money. I'm aware where a lot of the blame lies, clan leader Yomaget. We need to gather the remaining clan leaders and vote in a Mandalore. After today's events, neither the new Mandalorians nor the Death Watch are viable candidates to run Mandalore. Horus looked at me. Are you still willing to be our leader, General? I looked through the window at the devastated city. I've seen and ordered much worse, yet the few hours we slogged through the ruins affected me. This was Mandalore, and even if I didn't really recognize this world anymore, it was the one place I used to call home before I met Ashara. Even if I had planned to burn it myself if the Death Watch actually won, which only made it worse, actually seeing Sundari wrecked. It changed something. Perhaps it was the way I used to feel about this place. Perhaps it was the fact that tonight I married Bo-Katan and became a Mandalorian myself, which meant that this was my home now. You know, I used to fight for an empire that wasn't mine. For a cause that I didn't really care for. I knew that the Empire needed to change in order to survive once the Old Republic was defeated. The Sith too, because it was only a matter of time before we tore each other apart. A tall skyscraper that had been burning for hours ever since tons of molten metal rained upon it crumbled in the distance. I think it's a high time to start fighting for something that's worth it. What is Mandalore to you? Yomaget asked. If you asked me yesterday, the honest answer would have been a means to an end. I answered truthfully. And today? Bo asked. I didn't feel her entering as I was too busy staring at the burning city. I turned around and looked at my wife, who now wore the standard armor of Mandal Motor's guards. Today I watched my new home burn. I felt thousands upon thousands Mandalorians die. I can't bring back all the people who murdered by the enemy. I can't do much to help the countless trapped in the ruins. What I can do is promise that this, I pointed at the windows, will be visited thousandfold upon the Confederacy, and that I won't stop before our enemies are crushed never to rise again. My voice was even though, yet full with the fury I felt and barely kept at bay. Vale's telling the truth. Obi-Wan added. He was giving me a wary look. Good. Satine nodded. General Vale, you have Clan Kreese's complete support in becoming Mandalore and prosecuting the war against the Confederacy of Independent System until a complete military victory. I second that. Bo smiled grimly. General, you have Clan Yomaget's support as well. Horus gave me a solemn nod. It's high time the galaxy remembers what happens when someone crosses our people. Remember Mandalore. =RK=. Part 6. Mandal Motors HQ. Sundari. Mandalore. Vale, what did you do this time? Valentra's holographic image scowled at me. I swear you exist to make my life harder. I love you too. I just did some contingency planning for when everything went straight to the deepest, darkest Corellian hell. I was stuck into a bunker with cut-off comms for the duration of the battle. I added. It wasn't as if I usually planned getting myself in such messes. I blame the Force. The senator from Undren and his buddies had been raising hell ever since they heard rumors about a new Mandalore. I've got the Chancellor, Senate and even the Jedi on my back wanting answers. The intel services are spinning interesting tales about Mandalore. What is happening over there? Valentra exclaimed. So that's the spokesman for everyone in the Senate who wants Mandalore done in permanently. I wondered if I could spin this mess so I could get out smelling like roses, but I doubted it. Palpy had been playing this game for a long time and had too many connections within the Senate. He knew where most of the bodies were buried too, probably because he put a lot of them there himself. That left me with trying to minimize the political fallout and getting as much out of a bad situation as I could. Politics is what happened. Long story short, both the new Mandalorians and Death Watch are compromised and can't be said to speak for the Mandalorians in general. There will be a clan leaders meeting shortly in order to elect a Mandalore, who will be able to take charge of this whole mess. The only good news is that Palian made it out of Chimera before his ship went up and he's recovering in medical. Good for him. He'll be getting a medal or two for holding as well as he did against overwhelming odds. When were you going to officially tell me you made a play for Mandalore yourself? Valentra glared at me. Once I knew I would have enough support so not to make myself look like an idiot, I sighed. You're aware that the only way we could trust United Mandalorians long-term is if the new Mandalore is friendly, right? If you're it, many senators will cry fault. Conflict of interests and such for starters, my colleague pointed out. To be honest, this isn't my first choice. If I got more time, I would have handled the job to Obi-Wan, but we simply don't have the time to make him a viable candidate. How so? Does it have something to do with certain marriages I heard about this morning? Valentra gave me an accusing look. You know, for people of our rank there's a proper way to handle such things. No time. If it was practical, you would have been on the top of my invite list. I shot back. As for the Jedi, kindly inform them that Master Kenobi is in need for congratulations over his nuptials. He married Duchess Satine last night, so he's a proper Mandalorian now. Who did you marry, or is it too horrible to contemplate? Valentra sounded like he dreaded the answer. Bo-Katan Kryze, Satine's sister, I stated proudly. I've heard that name before, but don't recall where. Valentra suspiciously narrowed his eyes at me. She's kind of former Death Watch. Ah, I see. So I should brace myself for livid senators screaming that you've married a terrorist. Please, compared to me, my wife is a little angel, yet the Senate didn't scream too loudly when I became Commander-in-Chief of the Republic's combat forces. You just gave a few freighter loads of ammunition to your detractors, you know that, right? Valentra sighed. I'm aware I'll have to answer some pointed questions by the Senate when I'm back on Coruscant. The political ramifications of my actions aren't lost on me, trust me about that. Really? Vale, you know you're likely losing your current position over the mess at Mandalore, right? Valentra groaned. Who is on the short list to replace me? I knew it was likely to happen the moment diplomatic support for my mission to Mandalore vanished in thin air. Yularen, myself, Yoda and Plo Koon. Just make sure that the Jedi don't get the position or we're grift. The thought has crossed my mind. Yularen is a likely shoo-in after you left him in tactical command over Geonosis. That might very well be the deciding factor, Valentra said. Will my official endorsement help him or not? That remains to be seen. It will depend on the fallout from Mandalore. I see. What about reinforcements? I'll probably be Mandalore by the end of the day and I'll want an official alliance with the Republic. As you know, yesterday the Mandalorian Navy ceased to exist. We need this system fortified against further Sis incursions for strategic reasons that had nothing to do with who actually rules Mandalore. Losing this hyperlane will have nasty consequences. I'm pulling 2 battle groups from the reserve and sending them to reinforce Commodore Holt. She'll be instructed to protect the system for the foreseeable future. That should be enough. Once I had a few silencer-equipped ships operational, Mandalore would be reasonably secure and those forces would tide us up until then. On another note, the investigation of Skywalker's stunt is almost complete. All the agents need is to talk with yourself and the Skywalkers. When are you going to make them appear? I'm not really comfortable with you keeping a general under wraps for weeks, not to mention the senator. Padme's still in coma, though the last I heard she's likely to recover soon. As for Anakin Skywalker, do you really want to lose cannon like him running through the galaxy without supervision? I'll collect and bring him to Coruscant once I've wrapped up things here. I groaned. When all was said and done, Anakin's screw-up was going to be a massive pain in the ass to handle. You should have just dumped him to the Jedi. Valentra shook his head. And risk him falling to the dark side or even joining Dooku and company in a misguided attempt to save his wife? That whole mess was a textbook example on how to mess up with a Jedi's head and potentially turn them. Quite successful too. Damn. Is he salvageable? What is Skywalker likely to do if found guilty on all charges? That depends on his state of mind, but I doubt that he'll quietly fall on his sword. The man has little loyalty to the Jedi Order or the Republic as a whole. Instead he believes in people, chief among them being his wife. Amidala might be the key to dealing with him, but that depends on her state of mind once she's awake. Skywalker's a ticking time bomb then. Valentra groaned. It's a distinct possibility. What are you going to do when you become Mandalore? He asked the big question. Align the Mandalorians with the Republic, make sure this system is secure and sick them on the Confederacy. In the medium to long term, make them useful allies while keeping the clan leaders from getting any ideas about galactic domination. After all, we don't need a repeat of the Mandalorian Wars. You know, the Senate won't take it that way. Of course not. Many will see it as me building myself an empire, the bloody idiots. They might very well be right, But that was another question. General Vale, the clan leaders are arriving as we speak. Your presence is required in conference room 1. One of Yomaget's aides interrupted us. I'll be there momentarily. I dismissed the man and returned my attention to Valentra. I'll be back ASAP and will do my best to give you some cover as far as the Senate is concerned. They'll be too busy dealing with my new status if things don't go ever more wrong over here. I have to go. May the Force be with you. I waved at the grumpy-looking general and cut the connection. It was time to face the music, as they say. I needed to become Mandalore and finalize my plans before heading back. At least the Confederacy attack gave me a starting point for dealing with the Mandalorians. I was planning on using the inevitable outrage and fury to begin some creative nation building that would hopefully culminate into the creation of a stable power block under my command. Yet, first things first. I had to be chosen as a Mandalore before I could go ahead. =RK=. Part 7. Conference Room 1. Mandal Motors HQ. Sundari. Mandalore. If there ever was a huge neon sign announcing that I was living in a different era, this was it. We were here to decide who would be the new Mandalore, with all major clan leaders who survived the attack either present in person or via holocom. This hallowed location wasn't the bridge of a mighty warship proudly displaying the power of the Mandalorian people for everyone to see. We weren't in the command center of a large military base surrounded by enough warriors and equipment to take over a couple of well-developed worlds. Instead, we were gathered in a lavishly decorated corporate conference room. I'm sure most former Mandalores would either find it funny or were too busy rolling in their graves. At least the seats were comfortable. I cut short my musings and returned my attention to the proceedings. Clans Yomaget, Orvad, Skada and Kryze were present in person. Many more, almost 24, chief among them Mordo, Brala, Jadik, Priest were here via the holocom. At least a third of them were former Death Watch sympathizers who turned on Vizsla and company once Grievous tried to burn Mandalore. All of them agreed that whoever remained loyal to Death Watch needed to die and that Satine's new Mandalorians' pacifistic policies were directly to blame for the Confederacy executing a successful attack. That was it. In one stroke, Grievous managed to crush up the only two groups which had a prayer of keeping Mandalore together, and now no one could agree on what to do. Well, almost no one. We're all aware that our current government is dysfunctional and won't be accepted as our leaders even if most of them didn't die yesterday. Horus was doing his best impression of snake oil salesman. The less said about Vizsla and his goons the better. He trailed off as even mentioning the Death Watch leader in this company led to loud grumble and a lot of quiet cursing Clan Vizsla to hell and back. We were back at this, everyone knew it had been repeated again and again for hours, yet we weren't closer to making a decision. I had my supporters, enough to ensure that no one else could become Mandalore. Which wasn't as good as it sounded considering that after Vizsla criffed up any chances he had for the title, there simply wasn't another viable candidate. However, that didn't mean I would be elected, which left us with a lot of accusations and power vacuum. You see, a lot of the clan leaders were quite wary of choosing a Mandalore in the first place. Doing so was going to shake things up and would technically place them under his or her command. Oh, there were traditional ways of either avoiding or contesting commands given by Mandalore. Most of them led to personal challenge and fair combat. At least half of the clan leaders didn't appear fit enough to even slow me down if we had a go at each other if I wasn't using the Force. That left them with naming a champion, but doing so would be opening another can of worms and hurt their standing. Others were apprehensive of where I would lead Mandalore, especially those who were part of Satine's new Mandalorians. I've heard a lot of bemoaning our situation. A lot of accusations hurled at various parties, Yomaget continued. What I haven't heard are plans on how to deal with that predicament. We know your idea, put the Sith in charge and all will be well, Merrick Bralla said, sounding unconvinced. He was the leader of a now small and scattered yet still quite respected clan. Back in the day his ancestors were allies more of 10 than not, but that didn't mean much nowadays. Do you really expect me to wave my hand and solve all our problems? I can lie my ass off and promise you solutions that would make everyone here happy, and we all would know that as the lie it is. We all know the galaxy doesn't work that way. I shrugged. What I can offer you all is a shot at a better future for Mandalore as a whole, and most of you in particular. Some of us have seen what General Vale has to offer and are quite pleased with it. Horus added. Even before the immediate need of rebuilding the Mandalorian Navy, The designs I provided were going to see Mandal Motors make a killing, so Yomagit was in my corner for self-interest among other things. The same could be said for Thang Orvad. His wife and former clan leader didn't make it through the bombardment. The man was out for Confederate blood, something I would gladly offer along with lucrative contracts and designs for the consortium ran by his family. Arguably, those two clans were the most important as far as influence and resources go, and they were firmly on board, which meant that made their enemies mine by extension with all that entailed. There were more than a few clans in opposition just because of who my most powerful supporters were. Why did I want this job again? Some of you want to relive the old glories of the Mandalorian people. I pointed at a lot of clan leader, including every single Death Watch defector. You earn for the time when the very mention of Mandalorian warriors made people take notice and tremble. You want to experience that glory, the honor and satisfaction of meeting worthy opponents and besting them. Of course, if they did it as most Mandalorians in the past, everything would end in tears after significant chunks of the galaxy got burned again. At least Stephen had the right idea, but the war with the Republic put his plans on hold. It was too bad that the aftermath of the Empire's victory and subsequent disintegration in a civil war put a stop to his vision for the future. Others want a stable future. I nodded at those representing the new Mandalorians. You want to change how the galaxy sees us, and make no mistake, to the average person we're more often than not viewed as a scourge upon everything they hold dear. Understandable too. It wasn't like Mandalorians hadn't burned, raped and generally wrecked the cruff of the surrounding sectors and beyond since the original Mandalorian Wars of Revan's era. Do I need to spell out why clans Yomagit and Orvad support me? I looked at the clan leaders. I'm offering you a different path. I smiled and continued. It's probably the one thing we could be thankful to the Sis about. They made most of the galaxy hate their guts and yesterday declared themselves our enemies. You intend to use the Confederacy? General Skata took a guess. Indeed. While lacking any shred of honor, they're a powerful enemy, one we need to crush or see Mandalore burn again. Destroying them will offer us all the glory and combat a warrior could crave. My smile widened. Doing so the right way will change how we're seen by the rest of the galaxy. I offer you a path that will earn us many honors and acclaim. Bringing the Confederacy down will ensure we will be seen as protector of justice, a path that will inevitably lead to many conflicts worth fighting. It was true, even if I wasn't doing it from the good in my dark heart. Enlightened self-interest was the name of the game, and it worked. This is inspired by the Super Commando Codex, isn't it? Skata asked. You should know, General. You're one of the survivors from the true Mandalorians after all. When all is said and done, Jastamiriel had the right idea. I'm merely expanding on it and making the best of the bad situation we all find ourselves in. I looked at the assembled men and women. Most of you crave for the restoration of Mandalorian honor, don't you? You won't find it in the overly savage and wasteful ways of the Death Watch or the brutes who inspired them. You see both the Death Watch and new Mandalorians as people who rejected the old codes. Surprisingly, that came from Thang Orvad. They did, for the wrong reasons. Most people in Death Watch didn't know the meaning of honor. They paid it lip service while using our traditions as excuses for their criminal enterprises. I looked at the defectors from that faction. The new Mandalorians overreacted after the Civil War and rejected the warrior codes altogether, both the good and bad. There were good things. An offended new Mandalorian sneered. One's clan is their family. I see nothing wrong with being loyal to them in most cases. I see nothing wrong in approaching combat with honor and not going out of your way to cause slaughter for slaughter's sake, I stated. Not to mention that it was ridiculous for a Sith to lecture people about how being too brutal and being murderous criffing bastard for its own sake hurt your agenda much more than it helped. That's surprising coming from a Sith Lord. Cole Ordo spoke for the first time since the gathering began. Though I shouldn't be surprised given who you are. Oh, I used to be one of those stereotypical murderous bastards a long time ago. For no good reason either, just because it was often expected as a Dark Council member's apprentice and I was too afraid of the consequences not to act as a psychotic killer. I shrugged. What? I was far from perfect and used to be a coward. It turned out that killing and torturing copious amount of people could be surprisingly doable if the alternative was either suicide or to die screaming. By the time I had enough personal power to stand up to the likes of Barras, I had been quite warped. If it wasn't for Stephen, Mako, Veta and few other people, I would have easily fallen to the dark side as a way of escapism from the hell I found myself in. My words made the clan leaders think. If it wasn't for a handful of people that helped me find a better way, I trailed off. Criffit, all my friends were dead for a long criffing time. For a moment I was almost overwhelmed by a wave of fury aimed at my predicament, and it took me a few seconds to put my emotions back under control. That's the core of what I'm proposing. Honor and glory earned in battle as soldiers instead of raiders and brigands. That's more than what the Death Watch under Vizsla ever was. By now you're all aware that prior to the SIS attack, security forces and Republic commandos raided couple of hundred targets all across Mandalore. All of those were Death Watch criminal enterprises. There is more than enough evidence in the cities and countryside away from the bombarded areas to back up my words. Some of Death Watch activities were admittedly less than legal. Vincent Jadik admitted. He was one of Death Watch's oldest and staunchest supporters, however he obviously drew the line at aiding a foreign power in bombarding Mandalore. He had the distinction of being the first one to turn his clan against their former comrades and apparently wasn't afraid to own up to his scruff-ups. Even if this was our first meeting, the man was able to earn a bit of respect with his actions so far. Those who still wish to sell their services could do as honorable mercenaries instead as common thugs and guns for hire, I continued. As for the new Mandalorians here today. Yesterday, we all saw where your pacifism led. It might sound good in theory, but the galaxy isn't a nice forgiving place. Without sufficient armed forces to ensure neutrality, the only thing pacifism makes you is easy targets. It was time to throw the new Mandalorians a small bone. Still, I neither require or want to conscript those who won't volunteer to be soldiers ready to defend Mandalore and smite our enemies. A society can't exist if everyone is a warrior on the battlefield. It requires many, many people in positions that have little to do with combat. That doesn't make them worthless either. The basic idea does have its merits. How do you propose to actually pull it off? Brala asked. If we make you Mandalore, all of us will sacrifice something, even if it's just a bit of our freedom to act as we will without a higher authority. What are you putting on the line for Mandalorians as a whole? What are you going to sacrifice for our people? In various ways. First and easiest, my personal resources, which as a few of you can attest aren't exactly insignificant. Yomaget smiled at the thought of what I offered him and Mandal Motors. I continued to outline the general plan I presented to Scarta and the rest of the clone army trainers, which had been further refined by their suggestion. Little things like consolidating the whole sector under Mandalorian aegis, using resources either loaned from the Republic or appropriated from the enemy to jumpstart an industrial build-up that would turn us into an economic powerhouse. The small steps that would turn the Mandalorians into a real nation besides being only culture. It might work, though I don't think that the Senate would authorize a lot of help coming our way. Orvad noted. I'm not expecting them to. Let's be honest, as far as I know, about half of the Senate wants us as allies while the rest would love nothing more than see us gone once and for all. I'm banking on the strategic importance of this system and working through the GAR for both securing it and helping with our industry. Both the Army and Navy could use additional sources of spare parts and equipment closer to the front lines. Are you sure you could pull it off? Scarta asked. Using my position? Probably not. General Valentra, who oversees the logistics side of the conflict, can be persuaded to help in that regard anyway. I nodded at Scarta. That links with clan leader Baylor's other question. What I'm putting on the line for you all. I looked at them. Right now, as the commanding officer of all Republic combat forces, I'm one of the most powerful people in the galaxy. It is a position that barring a major kerfup I could conceivably hold at least until the war is over and further leverage it into either political office within the Republic or to practically continue controlling the GAR once the conflict is resolved. And? Jadik prompted me to continue. If you choose me as Mandalore, I'll be kissing that position goodbye at the very least. It could very well cost me the rank of a general as well. When all is said and done, it is a great sacrifice. Together we might be able to make Mandalore a power that would give both the Republic and Confederacy pause, but that day is years away at best. I looked at Brala. I am a Sith Lord. We crave power, it's almost everything to us, and that's what I'm ready to sacrifice in order to lead you. Because yesterday I had an epiphany, you're my people and you are worth it. Well, that gave them pause. Truth to be told, I wasn't entirely honest with them. While I had incredible power at my fingertips given my current rank, that position was quite precarious without solid political backing, and that was something I lacked. With Amidala's poisoning and Skywalker going on the deep end, I lost any support Padme could provide on that front. Hopefully she would recover and might still be useful, yet her political backing was going to be worth quite less than before, at best. That left me with only two feasible backers. One was Corellia, but that would take a lot of work to come into fruition. Just a single meeting with the planet's leadership was merely testing the waters after all. My other choice was Mandalore. While I would have preferred for things to have gone differently here, well, there was nothing about it. I couldn't conjure a 6 or more months before this whole situation came to a head and thus engineer either Kenobi or Bo-Katan as viable Mandalore candidate as per my original plans. In the end, I was left with rolling the dice and doing my best to take advantage of the situation I was maneuvered in by Palpy. All I had left was hoping that the fallout I would soon face would be worth the eventual gains. At least I came ahead with a badass and beautiful wife I was fond of. We've been here for long enough. Yomaget slammed his fist on the wooden table dominating the room. We've all heard what General Vale intends to do if he becomes Mandalore. What he offers and is prepared to sacrifice for us. Considering that we simply lack another candidate that might garner any reasonable amount of support, it's high time we vote. Horus stood up and took a deep breath. Clan Yomaget nominates Delcatar Vale, leader of Clan Vale, for Mandalore. He has our complete support. Yomaget stood at attention and gave me a Mandalorian salute by thumping his chest above the heart with his right fist. Clan Orvad. Thang voiced his support, followed by Satine and Scarter. The die was cast. Remember Mandalore. =RK equals. Part 8. Mandal Motors HQ. Sundari. Mandalore. It's funny. I don't feel different. I expected something more. I trailed off and looked at my wife, who was standing next to me and gazing through the windows. Congratulations, Delcatar. Bo paused and smiled. Mandalore. She savored the word. I can't say I really expected this when I met you back on Ryloth. Nonsense. All the histories will claim you knew my greatness the moment you laid your eyes upon me. They'll add something about love at first sight too. I quipped and earned myself a poke in the ribs. As long we're the ones who get to write them. The alternative is not acceptable. No, it's not. My wife agreed. It was a bit touch and go, but in the end I did get just enough support to earn the title and everything that went with it, which was a greatly increased workload. My sister isn't too pleased with your decision, Bo informed me. The best thing for her is to be away from here. Many will blame her for the devastation. She was in charge. Had been for more than a decade. In the end it was Satine's responsibility, even if she had less control overall than many would like to believe. True enough. We need a new ambassador to the Republic, and given her connection with the new Mandalorians and overall pacifistic nature, the Senate will love her. If she plays her cards right, they will never see her coming. It's a pity it took this to open her eyes, Bo sighed as she stared at the devastation. I put a reassuring hand on her shoulder and squeezed it gently. At least she sees it now. There are some who wouldn't open their eyes even after something like this. Are you talking from experience? Yeah, I sighed. Hopefully, once she awoke, Amidala would be sane and her eyes would be open too. If the bio-attacks on Naboo couldn't do it when combined with her current ordeal, nothing was going to cut it. Besides, that way you'll be able to keep her near Kenobi. Those two need some chilling out. The Jedi Council's reaction to his marriage might put a damper on their honeymoon. What about Towers? Satine's a big girl, she'll have to improvise. I want you to lead my personal strike force. Small, elite, geared for rapid deployment and facing Force adepts. Incidentally, that would keep us quite close. Can't keep your hands off me already? Bo chuckled, before becoming serious. How many men, and is there any special equipment you require? Besides your personal arms and armor, I'll be providing access to top-of-the-line Republic gear as well as whatever specialized equipment money can buy. Does that include basilisks? Speaking about them, they're quite sturdy and might have survived even if we have to dug them out. And yes, our unit will be equipped with them once sufficient numbers can be produced. As for numbers, I want at least a platoon. I'll see to it. Bo nodded. You know some of the clan leaders will be trouble even among those who supported you, right? My wife changed the topic. And I don't mean challenging you to a single combat. Undermining my authority and trying to assassinate me, you mean? Yep, I'm expecting it, though they just have to join my fan club just like the rest. Some people didn't really like me taking charge and issuing running orders moments after I was given the title, even if they expected it. Step 1 was consolidating here on Mandalore, eliminating Death Watch remnants and whatever Sis forces made it to the ground, all the while executing SAR. Once that was done, Scarter, who would be running things for me here, was going to storm Concordia and clear it from DW elements. Step 2 was for Yomaget, Orwid and their colleagues kicking up the industry in high gear as well as implementing radical expansion. They would be opening new factories, building new shipyards and working on building a brand new navy as well as producing the heavy equipment for a whole army. It was a tall order, one that they couldn't do without outside help. That was step 3 and for me to worry about. My Black Ops units would be funneling both funds, equipment and specialists this way, while I had to not only make the call for the spread-out Mandalorians to come home but also plan the incorporation of this whole sector under our rule. All that was just the beginning too, and on top of my other duties. It will be a few days before we leave for Coruscant. I want you to select your men as well as assist Cole as much as possible. I'll do all I can to help him. Bo nodded. I made Order the one in charge of the Mandalorian Protectors, the formal name of the local police and non-military security forces. That had the benefit of giving him a lot of resources for locating his daughter. I was careful not to mention to his face that she might not have survived the bombardment, and even if she did, it was likely that her Death Watch kidnappers killed her and made themselves scarce. I'll get to if this is all. Yes. I'll see you tonight. And I'll have you all to myself then. Is that a promise? If you're a good Mandalore. Bo pulled me closer and gave me a searing kiss before winking and sauntering off. I'll let you do the boring stuff. I watched her retreating form until she left the office I had commandeered for my own use and shook my head. I've forgotten what married life used to be and didn't know how much I missed the little things until now, even if I knew it would be different with Bo. Alright, what was the next thing on the agenda? Damn it, I needed another aide or two. At least I'll be getting Piet back soon. Yes, choosing people to head education, medical and civilian infrastructure from the new Mandalorians. Then I was going to interview Brala for internal minister or something in that vein. Crufit, I've forgotten how much work was setting up a new government after the previous one got vaporized. At least this time I didn't have to deal with newly conquered worlds, so there would be less issues than Balmorra and Alderaan, right? Crufit, who am I kidding? It was just a matter of time before something went to hell just to be a massive pain in my ass. I had to get myself into gear, because in less than an hour I would be meeting Orwid to discuss the standard equipment for the planned Mandalorian army. Once that was done, Thang, who was to be my deputy financial minister, and Yomaget, the actual financial minister, would be both on my case to figure out how the cruff we were going to pay for rebuilding after the attack, creating a brand new navy and army, not to mention the industrial expansion. That wasn't going to be fun. Note to self, see if I could capture high-ranking members of the banking clans and blackmail them for copious amounts of money. =RK Part 9. Hunter Flight. Great Desert. Mandalore. Obi-Wan paid barely any attention to the commando squad strapped beside him in the passenger compartment of the Mandalorian fighter transport. The Jedi was busy contemplating everything that happened lately and the ways it affected him. He toned out the clones' banter and the whine of the engines, focusing on his issues. Kenobi felt drifting, lost. Less than a day ago, he, a Jedi Master, practically trampled on the Order's rules and millennia of tradition by following his heart. Worse, he hadn't really thought about all consequences, despite he felt sure he had considered the ramifications of his decision. The inevitable confrontation with the Jedi Council he expected, and it would be something to deal with in just a few days. Spending the rest of his life with Satine, he simply loved that idea. Even becoming a Mandalorian hadn't sounded too bad as long as he didn't act as the stereotypical brutes as whom the average Mandalorian had been portrayed across the galaxy. Things weren't so simple and clear-cut after all. Obi-Wan could very well imagine being a Mandalorian and yet doing his best to protect the Republic from her enemies. Those things weren't mutually exclusive after all. Besides, strictly speaking, there wasn't something within the core of Mandalorian culture that forced someone to become a murderous bastard. He should know, after all. Kenobi did go over a refresher course of Mandalorian history and customs while contemplating if marrying Satine was a good idea. What he found hard to reconcile within himself was how the love he felt towards his wife was affecting him as a person. Merely admitting it to himself hadn't been too hard, despite how it felt at the time. Marrying, on the other hand, it was different, a proof of his commitment to Satine. A step he simply wouldn't want to take back even if he was offered the choice. The things we do for love. Obi-Wan whispered too quietly for the clones to hear. That was the crux of the matter, wasn't it? Ultimately his marriage was a choice between what he believed in as a Jedi and what he wanted as a man in love. If he had to be honest to himself, Obi-Wan chose to be selfish, and that changed him. It subtly shifted his priorities and made it easier to disregard his nature as a Jedi when making a decision. His mind drifted back to the bunker. A week or two ago, Obi-Wan was sure he would have confronted Vale violently over the murder of the two medics. He still wanted to do it. That wasn't a necessary kill in the heat of combat, it wasn't an understandable military decision that led to those deaths. Morally, Kenobi knew what was the right thing. Legally too, even if it wasn't really his place to place judgment in that context. Strictly speaking, that was for the local security forces to deal with, even if it was now probably a moot point. Vale was busy making his bid for Mandalore, and if successful, the worst he was going to face would be a personal challenge or two from family or friends of those men. As a Jedi, yesterday Obi-Wan truly saw what a Sith in control of the dark side looked like. He knew his duty then. Kenobi was ready to fight an enemy he had been trained to smite ever since he could remember anything. Instead, Vale started talking and Obi-Wan stayed his hand long enough to listen. At the beginning, it wasn't because he believed that Del-Qatar could persuade him not to attack. It wasn't even because Kenobi was pretty sure he couldn't win. He would have fought anyway. No. What stayed his hand was Satine's presence. There was a part of Obi-Wan buried below all his training as a Jedi that simply refused to expose her to an all-out fight between him and a Sith Lord. Yesterday, Obi-Wan refused to even think about that, yet the thought was in subconsciousness. It was in his heart. Kenobi was afraid of dying without spending more time with his wife. He was afraid of what would happen to her if Vale had to cut him down, even if Satine was the Sith sister-in-law. So he listened, prepared for his last stand, yet his heart desired for a way out. When Vale offered it to him, Obi-Wan's hands became clutched fists. Even worse, Kenobi could see that he did the right thing in that bunker. Dying there wasn't going to achieve anything. After Windu's actions during the Jedi Temple's attack, an attack against Vale by another Jedi Master executed without proof for betrayal against the Republic was going to damn the Jedi Order in the eyes of the galaxy. Well played. Obi-Wan muttered. Sir? Nina, Omega Squad's leader asked. Nothing, I'm just thinking aloud. Carry on. Obi-Wan dismissed the clone's question. The Jedi Master hadn't thought about that in the bunker. Kenobi had acted out of reflex born of his training, of the way he had been taught. The right thing to do seemed so obvious then, and he never thought about the consequences beyond either somehow succeeding or his much more likely death. Obi-Wan wanted to think that he knew Vale somewhat. The Sith simply wasn't going to tolerate another attack upon himself by the Jedi. At best, the man was going to wait until the war wasn't hanging in the balance before retaliating. At worst, a confrontation between the man commanding all Republic combat troops and the Jedi was going to lead to a short and brutal civil war that would have damned the Republic. The worst thing was that even now, Obi-Wan wasn't sure where exactly Vale stood. While he had his suspicions, he wasn't sure about Del-Qatar's long-term plans. Ultimately, was the Sith an ally to the Republic, or would he see it fall once the war was over? Would he continue with his live and let live policy towards the Jedi? Would Vale try to corrupt them or simply offer another way? What was the truth and what were lies spun by a Sith Lord? Kenobi shook his head and concentrated. His mind was wandering, avoiding a topic he feared to contemplate. It was something Satine asked him shortly after they arrived at Mandal Motors HQ. What would have you done in Vale's place? Obi-Wan's wife had asked. I know what I should feel. He did kill 2 of my people, yet he saved my little sister. Obi-Wan was afraid to face that question, even if Vale did ask it too, back in the bunker. He had done his best to dismiss it. After all, a Jedi's answer was obvious, was it not? It was anything but, even if you didn't bring morality into the question. At the time, Satine was the leader of Mandalore's government. She still was unless Vale was already chosen as Mandalore. That by itself warped the question. Because of her position, Satine was more important than 2 regular medics. Sacrificing them to keep her alive and hale would be more than a fair price to pay. Doing so would have been the correct decision on many levels, and a proper Jedi would likely agree. Even if doing so came dangerously close to flirting with the dark side. However, when he was asked that question, Satine's status didn't matter. It was about what Obi-Wan would do to keep his wife alive. Now he knew the lengths Vale would go to. Not too long ago, he saw what Anakin would do for a very long shot at helping Padme, his now not-so-secret wife. What was Obi-Wan Kenobi going to do to keep Satine safe? The Jedi was afraid of that question. It made him shiver as if the dark side itself was touching him when he thought about it. However, giving an answer, that simply terrified him. Because, Obi-Wan Kenobi, a Jedi Master, simply didn't know. He might simply uphold his principles as a Jedi, or do anything in his power to keep Satine safe. Just as he had no compunction of going after Grievous, not because it was his duty as both a Jedi Master and a Republic General, but because his wife asked him to bring the Confederate General to justice. Obi-Wan sagged in his seat and wondered what was he supposed to do. In his agitated state, he missed the dark side's gentle touch that offered salvation. =RK=. Look alive, boys. Target side. 10K out. Obi-Wan's self-reflection was interrupted by the pilot. Is he alone? Kenobi was grateful for the distraction. I'm seeing a handful of commando droids and a few of SPs. Drop us behind the closest dune and strafe them a few times. I'm dealing with Grievous, you take out his guards. Obi-Wan ordered. Yes, General. Nina answered. The pilot's confirmation came in the form of him opening up with the craft's laser cannons. Scratch some droids. Be aware, enemy is splitting up. I'm dropping you on Grievous' right flank. Kenobi submerged into the Force and let it revitalize him. A moment later his worries were erased and replaced by unrivaled clarity. A minute later, Obi-Wan dropped from the hovering transport with the clones landing around him. Targets breaking to the right of your position. Good hunting. The assault transport screamed away to avoid any potential AA fire. Go. The Jedi Master ordered and sprinted after Grievous. He had no problem sensing the cyborg presence in the desert. Within seconds, Kenobi had the Sith General in sight. Grievous was busy climbing up the next dune, and unfortunately for him, the Jedi was in no mood for a protracted chase. Obi-Wan raised a hand and pulled back the cyborg, who gave out a strangled cry and tumbled down amidst a small sand avalanche. Kenobi jumped down and drew his lightsaber. Grievous. The Jedi stated blandly and activated his weapon. The cyborg stood up and drew a pair of stolen lightsabers. Kenobi? Grievous looked surprised seeing the Jedi wear Mandalorian armor. Obi-Wan narrowed his eyes. He recognized those lightsabers. They belonged to friends of his, who were now dead. Murdered by the being in front of him. Just like that, the calmness Kenobi felt since letting the Force flow freely through him, vanished. This thing. It was responsible for the death of millions, probably billions. It murdered Obi-Wan's friends. And it bombarded Mandalore, making Satine feel awful. It was Kenobi's duty to put an end to that abomination, and that's exactly what he was going to do. Obi-Wan shot forward, without even thinking. He was acting on instinct, reinforcing his body with the Force without even thinking, yet she obeyed. Grievous parried the first strike, yet stumbled back surprised by the strength behind the Jedi's attack. The cyborg tried to retaliate with his other blade, but his slash was parried with contemptuous ease before Kenobi's saber struck again, forcing the other general to retreat another step. It took all of Grievous' mechanically assisted strength and speed to keep Obi-Wan's azure blade from striking it. Despite that and all of his training, the cyborg was forced into a relentless retreat. That confused the Confederate commander. He had fought Kenobi before and was aware of how good the human was. This was something quite different. The Jedi was attacking with savagery he had never displayed before. Worse, the attacks were coming much faster and stronger than ever. Obi-Wan's blood sang. He fell into a rhythm of ceaseless attacks and found that for the first time in his life he really enjoyed a battle. Kenobi found himself pouring all his frustration, uncertainties and fear into his strikes, and it was liberating. That thought made him falter and gave Grievous a chance to jump back so he could take a breather. The Jedi frowned. He couldn't really feel the dark side trying to influence him. There was no anger to feed her, even if he was frustrated. Yet there was fear. The cyborg counterattacked before Kenobi could think about it all. The Jedi easily fell into a Soresu form and started deflecting the incoming attacks. They were much easier to read than ever before. Anticipating them was simpler, natural. "You're different today, Kenobi," Grievous spoke. "For a moment there you fought almost like a Sith." Obi-Wan's eyes widened at that declaration and it almost cost him everything. The cyborg used that brief surprise to explode into motion and did his best to dismember Kenobi. Only a last-ditch shove using the Force kept the Jedi intact. Grievous stumbled back and laughed. "Did I hit a sore spot? Did you enjoy my little performance?" Granted, it was interrupted before the best part. The mechanical menace went silent when Obi-Wan went on the offensive. This time Kenobi felt anger. Grievous stared joke in his face over the murder of countless people. Satine's people. Obi-Wan's people now. It was Grievous and Vizsla who planned the attack and almost got Satine's sister murdered. Tried to kill them all with orbital strikes and only failed because of Palian's last stand and the death of the Mandalorian Navy. It dawned on Obi-Wan that he was facing one of the people that almost murdered his wife yesterday. Kenobi's anger boiled and his composure simply shattered. A cold wave washed over Obi-Wan as he fell upon the cyborg and he felt more powerful with every strike he delivered at Grievous. The combatants blurred as they engaged into a flurry of blows and then it was over. A metal hand flew away, separated at the elbow. Obi-Wan continued his onslaught and slammed his lightsaber into Grievous' remaining blade again and again. The third strike was too much and it broke the cyborg's guard. The azure blade flashed down and severed Grievous' other hand at the shoulder. The two generals glared at each other for a long moment. "I won't yield," Grievous screamed. "I won't be put into a crithing jar again." If he was physically capable of it, the cyborg would be foaming at the mouth at that point. "Surrender?" Obi-Wan asked calmly. There was no trace of anger in the Jedi's voice. Kenobi felt cold. He could sense the dark side's touch upon him. Despite what he expected, she wasn't tempting him. Wasn't demanding that he strike down Grievous. The dark side simply waited, ready to follow his directions. "You did escape the last time," Kenobi reasonably pointed out, surprised by Grievous' reaction. "I won't be held again," the cyborg shouted and lunged at the Jedi. Obi-Wan raised a hand and picked up Grievous using the Force, suspending him in midair. "What am I to do with you?" the Jedi wondered aloud. Grievous decided to stay silent at that point and simply balefully glared at Kenobi. "You know, my wife wants you brought to justice," Obi-Wan repeated Satine's request. There was silence, before Grievous laughed. "Wife? The Jedi's poster boy is married? Was she here yesterday? Did I get her?" The cyborg sneered in an obvious attempt to provoke Kenobi. "She was. In fact, we married yesterday. This is her world you wrecked," Obi-Wan snapped. "Good." Kenobi could imagine Grievous' smile and the very thought made him snarl. Below his helmet, Obi-Wan's eyes got bled into yellow. The Jedi's hand gripped his lightsaber harder. "You know, there are probably a lot of good reasons why I should bring you in right now. Intelligence among other things. After all, you should stand trial for my crimes." "Crimes?" Grievous laughed. "My only crime is that I've been a more successful general than all of you Jedi put together. It took a Sith being in charge of your forces to stalemate us. No matter how loath am I to admit it, you're right about that," Obi-Wan noted. "In the end, we Jedi are diplomats and peacekeepers, not soldiers or proper generals," Kenobi sighed. "A Jedi in my position would capture and bring you back." Grievous' glare intensified and he started struggling into the telekinetic grip. "As I am now, I no longer have the right to call myself a Jedi," Obi-Wan stated in contemplative tone. "I chose love over the Jedi Order. It's hard to admit it, but today I'm on a path that one day might make me choose between Mandalore and the Republic." Kenobi paused. "I'm pretty sure I'll take my wife's lead on that one." Obi-Wan smiled, even if Grievous couldn't see it. "So what? It's funny, you know. I've walked away from all I knew and I didn't really realize it up until now. I've already made my choices. All I needed was to understand why." Obi-Wan took a step forward. "If I continued to consider myself a Jedi, I would have been torn apart by divided loyalties. Another step and Kenobi was within a hand's reach of the cyborg. I didn't really get it until we crossed blades. If you were anyone else besides Vizsla, I might have failed to understand. Yet, fighting you, a man who tried to murder my wife. It was a revelation. What the criff are you talking about, Jedi? I'm rambling, am I not? Feeling free. It's strange, you know. Liberating. Obi-Wan stared at Grievous. Kenobi raised his lightsaber and brought it down in one swift motion, then he released the cyborg. Grievous fell on the ground in 2 pieces. It was strange. Perhaps it was because Obi-Wan didn't strike down in anger. He didn't feel the dark side falling upon him. Didn't feel like falling after executing Grievous in a cold blood. Instead, Obi-Wan felt at peace now that a threat to his wife was removed from existence. Nina, status report. Do you need assistance? Kenobi activated his comm. We're just wrapping up, General. Grievous? He won't trouble us ever again. Good work, sir. The commando congratulated him. Hunter Flight, come and get us. Obi-Wan ordered their ride to collect them. On the flight back, Kenobi would have time to contemplate his actions and the conclusions he reached.